Hey guys, and welcome back to our lecture series. And we are picking things up right where we left off. In our last lecture, we discussed the opening moves of Reconstruction, presidential Reconstruction under Andrew Johnson. Johnson, as we noted, was a Southern politician. He was from the backwoods region of Tennessee. He made a career. He made a name for himself early in his career by opposing the Slavocrats. But he was also a deeply racist man who held a lot of animosity and hatred toward the African American community. And he had already displayed a willingness to allow the Slavocrats to come back into power. He quickly came to loggerheads with the Republicans in Congress and Republicans in his cabinet, and saw the Southern Democrats, or the return to power of Southern Democrats, has his best had been in his best interest, as making common cause with them, and making common cause with the Democrats in Congress would enable him to ride away back into the presidency in the 1868 election. And it is from there that we sort of pick things up. So Johnson vetoed legislation passed to extend the life of the Freedmen's Bureau. And he cited it as unconstitutional to support indigents. Basically, you would call them homeless. He said that was unconstitutional to support them at federal expense. Now, the veto stood as Democrats and moderate Republicans refused to act against Johnson. In celebration with Confederate sympathizers, Johnson gave an impromptu speech in which he labeled the radical Republicans as traitors. The veto and the speech drove many moderates into the radical Republican camp. Undeterred, Congress pressed forward and passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Now, this act gave federal guarantees to the right to own or rent property, make contracts, access to courts, in addition to defining citizenship. Now, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 also authorized the federal government to file lawsuits on behalf of anyone whose rights had been violated. Now, Johnson again exercised his veto powers. This time, he justified his veto by saying that his objection was rooted in opposition to having European immigrants wait 5 years for citizenship, while former slaves will receive citizenship immediately. With this, Johnson went too far, and the Republican Party passed a second act extending the Freedmen's Bureau that required African Americans to purchase the land confiscated from ex-Confederates. Now, Johnson again vetoed this, and he vetoed this act. But his veto was overridden by Congress in July of that year. Now, Congress fully came to the conclusion that Johnson was an irresponsible reactionary, and they now determined to control Reconstruction by themselves. They had made the decision to formally break with working with Johnson on a Reconstruction strategy. They were now ready to simply engage in Reconstruction, in the process of handling Reconstruction all by themselves. Now, Congress and really the Republicans Party responded by Johnson's obstinacy by launching a political campaign, and a political rhetoric that became known as waving the bloody shirt, which largely involved blaming Democrats as the party of treason. The Republicans would use this tactic to maintain control of the federal government and really a number of state governments from 1866 until 1932, with three notable exceptions: Woodrow Wilson's presidency and Grover Cleveland's presidencies. In the 1866 elections, the Republicans gained a commanding 3-1 majority in Congress. They also gained control of every former free state governorship and state legislature. Now, Johnson's opposition spurred the radical Republicans to action, and they took the lead in setting congressional Reconstruction policy. They would use this for this strategy, this waving the bloody shirt, for much of the 19th century. Now, the Republican candidates would remind voters that the Democrats and really all Southerners had led the rebellion. Now, Andrew Johnson's presidency began promisingly in April and May of 1865, but things quickly soured, and the president alienated Congress. He alienated Republican leaders, and by the election of 1866, the radical Republicans in Congress received the boost that they needed to become the real power and to write their own Reconstruction program in Congress. Now, the election of 1866 was also a voter referendum, and this one was on the 14th Amendment. The amendment still needed to be passed by 4 former Confederate states to become law, and everyone was in agreement that for the amendment to receive to be received as unassailable by future constitutionality challenges, it had to be approved by 2/3 of all states, and not just 2/3 of the states that had stayed loyal to the Republic. Now, Johnson proposed that the amendment was simply unconstitutional, and he urged legislatures that they should not approve it and that they should vote against this measure. And one by one, former slave state legislatures voted against this measure. They all fell in line. The only former slave state, the only former Confederate state to approve the 14th Amendment, was Johnson's home state of Tennessee. Now, Johnson's behavior and his recalcitrance really just sent the last of the moderate Republicans into the arms of the radical Republicans. And now the radical Republicans began to put into practice their own Reconstruction policy. They began to believe that the former slave states, that the time was now right for the former slave state to be rebuilt from the ground up. They began to openly push for sterner measures to be taken against ex-rebels. They began to formulate an idea that a political alliance with African American voters was in the party's best interest. They realized that African Americans would be a necessary building block for long-term control of the region. Congress embarked on what ex-rebels termed the maddest and most infamous revolution in human history. In March of 1867, Congress passed the 2 Reconstruction Acts. Andrew Johnson vetoed both acts, necessitating both acts to be passed over his vetoes. Their legislations reflected the sense of urgency these men felt to get something accomplished and on the books. The first act nullified the state governments in all the former rebel states except Tennessee, because Tennessee had passed the 14th Amendment. And Tennessee was readmitted to the Republic because it had passed the 14th Amendment. Now, this act also created 5 military districts and imposed military rule in those districts. It also required the states to write new state constitutions recognizing African American male suffrage and ratification of the 14th Amendment. The second act allowed military commanders in those districts to begin enrolling African American voters. This legislation also disqualified 10% of the ex-Confederate population from voting. Now, Congress passed legislation. Now, Congress actually, at this point, they issued a direct challenge to President Johnson. They passed legislation limiting President Johnson's ability to remove cabinet members who had been approved by Congress. This was done to protect Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Stanton was a radical Republican and often at odds with Johnson. The Tenure of Office Act the Tenure of Office Act limited the president's control over the army. Johnson vetoed the Tenure of Office Act, but half were becoming quite common. Anytime an act was passed and Johnson vetoed it, Congress simply repassed the act. So the act was passed over his veto, and it caused a lot of uneasiness among Republicans. In the Southeast, Republicans began building this new coalition. They pressed forward, building this new coalition of freedmen, free state adventurers who were termed carpetbaggers, and local sympathizers who were termed scalawags. The majority, however, were the recalcitrant ex-rebels, and they shunned the Republican Party. They identified the party as the party of African Americans. They did not want anything to do with the Republican Party. And these ex-rebels, these recalcitrant ex-rebels, looked towards Andrew Johnson to help them and to stop this takeover of their states from happening. Their goal was to overthrow the Republic, restore their social order vis-a-vis white supremacy. Johnson, as it turned out, would not be able to assist them as his power was very quickly eroding. Congress had had enough of Johnson, and they were moving against him very strongly. And the methods to neutralize the president would be impeachment. As everyone should know, the House impeaches and the Senate convicts under the Constitution. The grounds for impeachment are high crimes and misdemeanors. Up to this point, and this is 1868, up until 1868, only 5 officials had ever been impeached in the history of the Republic. Only 2 had been convicted. The Republic was really just split on what to do. Moderates and conservatives thought that even though Johnson had done all he could to frustrate the process, even though Johnson had done all he could to frustrate the process of Reconstruction, he had not broken the law. He had not transgressed to the point that he could be impeached, which in summary meant that unlikability was not grounds for impeachment. The radicals wanted to go after Johnson. Regardless, they argued that impeachment was a political process, not a legal process. They argued that it was acceptable to go after Johnson in a political framework, not in a criminal proceeding. Now, Johnson was accused of abusing the executive office and his powers. Undeterred by impeachment rumblings or the Tenure of Office Act, Johnson went ahead and removed Stanton from office. He also removed the hardline anti-secessionist commanders from the military districts, and he continued his work at undermining Reconstruction efforts. Now, Congress at this point charged that the removal of Stanton violated the Tenure of Office Act. That action alone warranted impeachment, many said. Johnson did not believe the acts were constitutional, and he deliberately removed Stanton, hoping for a political victory at the radical Republicans in Congress' expense. Johnson truly believed that everything Congress had done regarding Reconstruction was unlawful. The Civil Rights Act, the other pieces of legislation, the amendments, he believed that Congress was going far beyond its mandate. So on February 24th, 1868, the House of Representatives voted, and voting strictly along party lines, they voted to impeach Johnson. The vote was 126 to 47. If Johnson was convicted, his successor would be Senator Benjamin Butler Wade of Ohio, who was the president pro tempore of the Senate. Now, as noted, Butler was a radical Republican. He was a rough political infighter. He was known for going toe-to-toe with slave state fire eaters back in the 1850s. Many worried that replacing Johnson with Butler would be just as problematic. Nonetheless, the trial against Johnson continued. 11 charges were levied against Johnson. 8 of those charges dealt with Stanton's removals, and the other accused Johnson of other offenses. The real motivation, once again, was the political, not criminal, acts of Andrew Johnson. Johnson was being pursued because of his attempts to frustrate Reconstruction. Beginning on March 4th and continuing for 11 weeks, the Johnson trial unfolded in the Senate. Now, Johnson ably defended his actions, and his defense raised a number of concerns and very credible points. One of which was impeachment should come about as a result of crimes indictable only in criminal courts, which they argued Johnson had not committed. They argued that impeachment was a criminal proceeding, not a political affair. They argued that the Tenure of Office Act only applied to the term of office for the person that appointed that office holder. Johnson had not been appointed by Stanton. Lincoln had. Johnson had not appointed Stanton. Lincoln had. They summed everything up by pointing out that the president was on trial for opposing members of the Republican Party. Now, a 2/3 majority is needed to convict in the Senate for impeachment trials. The final vote for Johnson's impeachment trial was 35-19. Impeachment failed by a single vote. All 12 Democrats and 7 dissenting Republicans voted against impeachment. And the big question with all that is why? Why did impeachment fail? Why did the Republicans fail to impeach Andrew Johnson? Well, the 7 dissenters who voted to acquit the president, they pretty much feared that they would be aiding in setting a very troubling precedent by which any legislature could remove a sitting president that they did not like for any reason. They were also really impressed by Johnson's behavior during the trial. He had become much more temperate. He stopped voicing attacks against his political opponents. He began to act more refined. He also agreed to enforce the Reconstruction Acts. Of the other pieces of federal legislature that he had opposed, he agreed to support all of them. All of these things came together to enhance Johnson, to enhance his look. Also, the possibility that Benjamin Franklin Wade will become president really frightened a lot of these men. So his change in behavior, the fact that he began to support these the federal legislation, the specter of a Wade presidency, all of these came together to save Andrew Johnson. And after his trial, Johnson offered no further resistance to congressional reconstruction. Johnson finished out his term without incident, and he left office a much more humbled man. And it is at this point that we'll break in our Reconstruction lecture series, and we'll pick back up with Congress now in undoubted control over the pace and the scope of Reconstruction. As always, I'm Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about this lecture, and we'll continue on with our series with part 4.